When you see the 747 take off or land, it's almost transfixing because the plane itself is so beautifully designed.
In 1977, Boeing delivered a modified 747 to NASA to use to ferry the space shuttle from its landing spot in California back to Cape Canaveral in Florida. In 1988, the 747-400 was introduced. This version had more efficient engines, longer range, and a modernized cockpit. It was the company's best-selling version.
Boeing called her the Superjet. The press called her Jumbo.
It makes the best landing of any airplane. And you are in awe that somebody even dreamt that this could fly.
When the first 747 rolled out of the factory, it was a huge event. All of the airlines who placed an order sent flight attendants to represent them, and each company's logo was included on the fuselage. In 1970, Boeing delivered 93 total 747 aircraft with over 60 passenger versions.
Pan Am will bring you the world's first 747.
Pan Am operated the first commercial flight in 1970. When it arrived in London, crowds of spectators greeted the arrival.
Because the public was so entranced with the 747, all of the major airlines had to have this airplane as their flagship.
Its jumbo size was something passengers, pilots, and flight attendants had to get used to.
My first introduction to the 747 was as a flight attendant in 1972. It was huge. Yeah, all of a sudden, the biggest airplane up until then was a 707 that needed 5 or 6 flight attendants. The 747 needed 14, and it had 5 different sections, and each section was a different size. It was chaos at the beginning.
So many airlines used the upper deck level of their first versions of the 747 as lounges for their first class passengers. Some airlines had lounges in coach, and American Airlines even had a piano bar in coach on its 747 for a short time.
Very extravagant, very luxurious. We had fresh flowers in crystal vases. Each meal had a special wine that was paired with it, and had to learn how to properly open champagne.
The first ever 747 prototype is still on display at the Museum of Flight in Seattle.
This is the upper deck experience. This was the interior that Boeing used to show the airlines the possibility of what that first class, that premier experience, that premier flying experience could be. Passengers could come up the spiral staircase and have a moment in the lounge.
Since its first commercial flight in 1970, Boeing's 747 jumbo jet has flown over 3.5 billion passengers.
Its development back in the 1960s was measured in billions of dollars. It was a pretty expensive airplane to develop at its time. You were building a whole new class of airplane, the biggest airplane in the world.
It's one of the most recognizable planes to take to the skies, with its iconic hump, 4 engines, extensive landing gear, and sheer size. The 747-8 tail height is equivalent to a 6-story building. It has a wingspan as wide as 2 737-700s lined up nose to tail. It can travel 7,790 nautical miles, carry over 450 passengers, with a takeoff weight of nearly 1 million pounds. The 747 ushered in more affordable long-haul air travel by increasing capacity and lowering ticket costs. It quickly became known as the Queen of the Skies and was the first plane to have 2 aisles and overhead bins.
Boeing was already on the map when the 747 came out, but what the 747 did for Boeing was inject the company with a little bit more glamour.
The flight deck was put on top of the plane so that the nose would open for easier loading. This gave the 747 its upper deck. Boeing produced the 747 for the last 55 years, during which a total of 1,574 airplanes were built for over 100-plus customers. The list price for a 747-8 in 2022 was over $400 million. But over the last few decades, airlines have looked for more ways to cut costs and to make airplanes as efficient as possible.
Airlines, even coming out of the pandemic, are trying to save as much money as they can. So they are looking for ways to have planes that are the most efficient possible. And right now, those are 2-engine jets.
The last 747 just rolled out of its Everett, Washington factory. It will go to Atlas Air for cargo deliveries. How the 747 changed aviation, and what the future looks like for Boeing's future aircraft. It was the beginning of the jet age. In the 1950s, Boeing introduced the 707, America's first jet airliner. Jet engines were safer, cheaper, and faster than piston engines. The number of people flying quadrupled between 1955 and 1972 as it became faster, more accessible, and financially possible. Pan American World Airways, or Pan Am, was one of the biggest carriers at the time.
So Pan American came to Boeing and said, we need an airplane twice the size of the 707. The head of Pan American Airways, Wantrip, said to Bill Allen, the CEO of Boeing, if you build that airplane, I'll buy it. And Bill Allen turned to Wantrip and said, if you buy it, I'll build it. And that's how the 747 got started.
In 1966, Pan Am put in an order for 25 new 747s.
One of the original design ideas for the 747 really was going along with what Pan American wanted, and that was building a double-decker.
Building a plane twice the size of its predecessor had a significant amount of challenges. The first iterations of the design were entirely double-decker, but that made it difficult to evacuate potentially 500 passengers safely and in a timely manner.
And this moment of innovation came in, and that was, instead of making a double-decker, why don't we make a wider airplane? Why don't we make a twin aisle, go 20 feet wide? And so the twin aisle, the wide-body jet was born.
Even though the design wasn't a full double-decker, it was still twice the size of the 707 and required new innovations.
What made it possible to make this giant jet was a revolution in engine technology. These new engines, especially compared to the turbojet engines of the day, were very efficient.
The 747 wasn't Boeing's biggest project at the time. It was also working on the 2707 Supersonic Transport, or SST.
What's interesting about the 747 when it was first introduced is airlines expected it to be an interim aircraft that they would use between their first generation of jets and the coming wave of supersonic planes that were expected to enter service later in the 1970s.
So the designers of the 747, they understood this, that at some point in the future, the 747s would be converted into freighters. And so they purposely set out to make the 747 the perfect freighter.
The SST program lost government funding and the prototypes were never finished.
Well, obviously, the supersonic era didn't happen quite the way we expected. And so, frankly, I think that led to a much longer life and much greater success for the 747. Once they finalized the specs for the plane, how are airports going to handle this plane that is more than twice as large with a wingspan more than twice the width of previous aircraft and an airplane that is much heavier? So that led to how Boeing designed the landing gear. It has 18 wheels and that's designed to spread out the weight of the plane so that it could use existing runways. But some airports had to widen their runways and taxiways. They built new terminals to handle this. They had to invest in new baggage handling systems.
In fact, the plane was so big, Boeing had to build a plant around it during its construction in Everett, Washington. Today, that building is the biggest in the world by volume, and where Boeing builds its other wide-bodies. These costs, along with the SST project and the development of its other new jet, the 737, created a significant financial strain on the company.
One of the biggest challenges for Boeing, how do they fund building it? Boeing bet the house on the 747.
There were people who said, literally, that this airplane would not fly. There were also people who said, financially, this airplane would not fly. It was a tremendous risk. That became one of the big issues in those days, that the money to build this airplane, that Boeing had to negotiate with creditors constantly to keep this program going, to keep the company going.
But that didn't stop Boeing. Joe Sutter, who is known as the father of the 747, led the design team, and they, along with other Boeing employees, were nicknamed the Incredibles for building the 747 in just 29 months.
It was the favorite airplane of the pilots.
Captain Lynn Ripplemeyer would eventually become the first woman to pilot a 747 and the first woman to captain a 747 transatlantic flight. She got her start flying cargo for Seaboard World Airlines.
They had professional engineers, so if you got hired as a pilot, you immediately went to the first officer seat. So this very unique set of circumstances happened at the exact right time for me to get hired by Seaboard World and as a 747 first officer and become the first woman to fly a 747. I went to work for People Express, first as a 737 first officer, upgraded with any gear to captain, again, which is almost unheard of. And then we got 747s. So I became a 747 captain at People Express in 1984. I had so much confidence in that plane. It flies beautifully. I think why many pilots like it is it makes the best landing of any airplane.
The plane was designed for long-haul flights, making international travel more accessible and affordable.
It only went to what we would consider to be important cities, major markets, world capitals. And having a 747 serve your airport was a badge of honor. What was also interesting is airlines viewed the 747 as legitimizing them. So a lot of airlines ordered the 747 when it was first introduced, even though probably they shouldn't have.
It also helped transform the air cargo market.
It wasn't long that the 747, with its capacity to be a great freighter, that freighter version came out, and that was in the early 70s with Lufthansa, and this is really where the airplane came into its own.
Airlines all over the world have flown the 747. It really runs the gamut, from United Airlines to Delta Airlines, KLM, Lufthansa, British Airways, Qantas. It was really a plane that flew all over the world.
Over the next few decades, the 747 continued to evolve with newer, improved versions. It also served other purposes, like government transport, including Air Force One.
Thanks for watching. And to make sure you don't miss out on anything by subscribing.